Hello and welcome to a special live ITV News Q&A. I'm Mary Nightingale. Now, after well, to put it mildly, a dramatic few days in Westminster, which began with a leaked video obtained by ITV News, we're examining the fallout and also asking what impact the events of this week will have both in Westminster and beyond. So to help me navigate this, I'm delighted to be joined by our UK editor, Paul Brand, the journalist, of course, who broke this extraordinary story on Tuesday, and by our political editor, Robert Peston, who's been covering the impact it's had in the corridors of power all week. And I'm going to start with you, Paul. Just for anyone who doesn't understand how these things work, how did the story come to you? How did it first break?
So, essentially, a source contacted us with the footage. So the footage that a lot of people have seen by now of this mock press conference that was being held by Allegra Stratton, who at the time was the Prime Minister's spokesperson, and she was rehearsing for these televised press conferences that were supposed to start at the start of this year. It was a new thing, never been done before, a bit like the White House press conferences that are held every day over there. So she was rehearsing, and colleagues were asking her questions, throwing her the kind of things that journalists might ask her. And we had a recording of that passed to us, which wasn't supposed to be in the public domain, of course. It was a rehearsal behind closed doors. And then we began analysing the footage, watching the footage, and we came across what was a very important clip. And
how long ago did that come to you?
So that was some weeks ago, and then it takes a lot of time to go through the legal process to get this kind of story to air. So it wasn't a case of us sort of looking at it and thinking, oh, that's an interesting story, I'll get round to it next week. We began looking at it weeks ago, and it took a very long time to go through line by line with all of our lawyers to make sure that story could get to air.
And what were the real legal challenges with it?
Well, you've got all sorts of considerations when a meeting like that is taking place behind closed doors. Firstly, there's a confidentiality issue, there's a privacy issue, and the most important thing for us is demonstrating a public interest in broadcasting that footage, given those other considerations. So that was what we were going through line by line. And there were many people in that room too, so we had to think carefully about who we wanted to identify. The main person speaking was Allegra Stratton. Ed Oldfield, one of the other advisors, was asking her questions in the audience, for want of a better word, who was asking her things relevant to this story. But there were others in there who were just, passive participants, and we didn't feel it was fair to identify them. So we had to think carefully about those things too.
So you blurred them, didn't you? I think there were four figures who were blurred, 4 or 5.
More than that, yeah. There were a handful of figures in the room who we blurred because they either hadn't asked anything that was of any interest to this particular story, or they hadn't spoken at all, actually. They were just watching, perhaps waiting to give Allegra feedback at the end of the session.
And it's all about timing, isn't it? Because this would have seemed like a dynamite clip a few weeks ago. But actually, the story of the Christmas party wasn't perhaps bubbling up in the forefront of people's minds. So it's once the Daily Mirror had run their story about this party that suddenly this became really very valuable and relevant. Yes?
Yeah, what really helped us with the public interest was that the government had spent a whole week denying that any Christmas party took place, or certainly that any rules were broken. And what we had was evidence of a party being discussed, even if maybe it was this hypothetical pretend party. It didn't necessarily look as though it was a hypothetical pretend party. And it was the tone of that meeting too. It was the laughing and joking that suggested that maybe these were people who weren't taking the rules that seriously, and we suddenly had an overriding public interest in broadcasting this footage to help the public decide, were the statements being made by the government consistent with what we understood was going on behind the scenes?
And then it hit our screens on Tuesday, and everything went crazy, didn't it? I mean, did you have any idea of the impact that it would have?
We knew it was an important story. I don't think I had quite anticipated the actual level of anger out there, because there have been quite a few stories so far during the pandemic of people in high-profile positions who've broken the rules. Perhaps I thought maybe the public might even have a bit of fatigue by now, thinking, oh, here we go, here's another one. But actually, for me, it felt like Dominic Cummings Mark II, perhaps even worse than that.
Because the Barnard Castle.
The Barnard Castle event, where he was accused of breaking the rules himself with the eye test, etc., etc. And a lot of people, I think, were more angry than they were about Dominic Cummings, because the government had seen that the public was not in any way going to stomach people breaking the rules in that way who were inside number 10. And yet here they were talking about potentially having done it again despite that outrage.
And there was a particular, an extra element to this, because, of course, you know, and we know, some of those involved, specifically Allegra Stratton, who used to work here and also used to work at the BBC.
Yeah, and that's an interesting consideration when we're going about any story. I mean, we're all journalists, and lots of us know the same contacts, and whether it's MPs or other journalists or ministers. I mean, Robert has to speak to people all the time that he knows on a personal level in Westminster, and you always have to try and remove yourself from the story as much as you can. It is hard when it's someone that you've worked with, who's been part of the ITV family, and Allegra was a well-liked and respected colleague here, and nobody here harbours any ill against Allegra. But, of course, this was a story in the public interest, and we had to remove those emotions that we might feel about someone we know and think, well, how would we run this story if it was anybody else that we might not know? And that's about how we went about everything throughout the process.
Yeah, had to be completely objective. But has anything surprised you about the way this story has played out, would you say?
I think the Prime Minister's apology in PMQs on Wednesday took me by surprise, just how stark that was, saying that he'd been sickened by the video that he had seen. I thought was a pretty extraordinary moment. I mean, it wasn't a full apology. He was apologising.
Was it?
No, he was apologising for the joke rather than, any party that may have taken place.
Or the impression it gave.
Yeah, the impression it gave that people were making light of the rules. He was still insisting that there hadn't been a party and that he'd been assured that no wrongdoing had taken place. But I think hearing any Prime Minister say sorry is quite a big moment. It does not happen very often. And
particularly not from this particular Prime Minister, it has to be said. Yeah. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Paul. But Robert, you've been around the block a few times. You've seen big stories come and go. Where would you place this one in terms of its importance?
Oh, it's very important. And it's also multi-layered. I just want to break it down briefly into those three layers as far as I can see it. One is we are confident, partly as a result of Paul's brilliant work, that senior people in Downing Street broke the lockdown rules by having a party. London was in Tier 3 on December the 18th. Parties were banned. We're as confident as we can be that a party was held. That's number one. Number two, since the Mirror published details of that party, the Downing Street has consistently said there was no party and no rules were broken. So the second issue here is the honesty of the Downing Street communications operation. And this is made all the more complicated, we might say, because, as I talked about yesterday and Paul reinforced today, Jack Doyle, who's now the most senior communications officer in the government, the Director of Communications, at the time he was deputy, he was at this party. In fact, he was sort of handing out certificates in a sort of jokey way.
What kind of certificates? Do we know what the certificates were for?
Oh, they were sort of award for, the sort of thing that goes on in parties, an award for...
end of year party, best dressed press officer, that sort of thing.
It was
very light-hearted stuff, all very jolly.
It's the kind of thing that happens at a party. But the fundamental point is he will be the person who's, first of all, advising the Prime Minister about whether or not there was a party. If he was at it, I don't think his views would be regarded as impartial. And secondly, look, I had a text from another press officer there only 2 days ago, and she said, Jack Doyle has asked me to send you this, and it says in terms there was no party. Now, I have to say, on the basis of everything we've learned, it's very hard for me, on the basis of having received that, to say, well, what else do I have to take with a pinch of salt that Downing Street is telling me? The credibility of that operation depends on, me believing that they are telling me the truth. And I'm not sure on this occasion they were. So that's a problem. And then the third thing, which again, I've sort of done a blog about this today, which might be, people are watching this might want to go and read, which is about the culture within Downing Street at this time. We now know there were many parties in Downing Street, Central Office, the Department for Education. And one of the things that a source told me yesterday, last night, in fact, and I've written about this, is that every Friday night, the press office takes out the booze.
Wine Time Friday, I was told. I was told Wine Time Friday.
Yeah, the booze comes out, and this was happening all through lockdown. Other people wander in and have a glass. One of the parties that has been referred to was the leaving party. I think it was 27th of November of a senior aide. She wanders in. They've already got the booze out. She wanders in. Other officials come in. Prime Minister wanders by, gives a farewell speech. Now, the defence is this is all sort of impromptu. We think that the party on December the 18th was actually, pre-arranged, invitations, all the rest of it. This one for the leaving party of this aid seems to be in sort of spur of the moment. But if you landed from Mars and you saw it, you would say this is a party. People are having drinks, they're having fun, it's a party. And the rules, again, at this particular juncture, we were in lockdown, were you couldn't mix with other households. You could only go to work if it was absolutely essential. None of this looks like work. Or it looks to everybody like a party. So goodness only knows how the Cabinet Secretary, there is another final problem, which actually Paul alluded to earlier, but I think we should reinforce this, OK? The Cabinet Secretary is responsible for the entire Whitehall apparatus, but particularly what goes on in Downing Street. He's in and out of Downing Street. This is a culture that he must have been aware of, and yet he has been told by the Prime Minister to investigate, in a sense, his own culture. Now, many people would say, there is such a clear conflict of interest here that if you're going to have a proper investigation, it shouldn't be held by the chap who's sort of in charge of all of this.
So many questions, aren't there?
Yeah.
There is great public anger about this, as you pointed out. There will be so many questions about trust, surely, for the Prime Minister and the wider apparatus of government, as you say. And people will surely be asking, they just have to find proof. Surely there'll be records. The police would know if something had happened. There will be records of who came and who went within number 10 Downing Street.
I don't know.
It is easily assessed, surely, isn't it?
Look, certainly in terms of, if as we understand, for some of these events there were outsiders, of course there are records of all of that. Every time I go into Downing Street, somebody records. I can't get in unless I've got a formal invitation.
Yeah.
So, of course, there are records for anybody who comes in and out. They've all got passes as well, which are screened. So, no, look, you can't...
It's easily investigated,
all of this stuff is easily investigated. What I don't know is how, we discovered in another case recently, that of the former health secretary in that embrace with a colleague, that there is CCTV throughout much of Whitehall. We don't know how much CCTV there is in Downing Street, which I don't, but I suspect there is some.
I suspect there's quite a lot, Robert.
So, exactly. Yeah. So this is not going to... but broadly, if you are the Cabinet Secretary, or indeed... It's hard for the Director of Communications, as we know he was at least one of these parties. But if you're the Cabinet Secretary, all you have to do is go, you just go up to various people and say, were you there? What happened? Why the Prime Minister wasn't able to do this, since it was plainly a matter of national concern days ago, is beyond many people.
And in the house where he lives.
Yeah, and in the house where he lives. But part of the problem is, of course, and I actually don't know whether Simon Case's remit will extend to the house in which he lives, because, of course, that is, in a sense, his private accommodation. Yeah. But one of the allegations is that there was at least one party held by, in his accommodation by his partner, Carrie Johnson. Just had this happy event today, the birth of a daughter. But, they are under pressure to say whether on, I think this was on November the 13th, from memory, lots of indications there was loud music and there was a party going on there. Again, if that was the case, it would have been against the rules.
All right, so there are all these, maybe they were parties, maybe they weren't, many questions. What effect? OK, first of all, what do you think is going on in 10 Downing Street now? And secondly, what is going to be the effect of all of this in terms of public trust, in terms of Tory backbenchers and their support for the Prime Minister? But let's start first of all. What do you think is going on in number 10 now?
There's a sort of, please, dear God, let's hope this all goes away kind of approach
it's not
going.
To go
but
away,
it can't. It simply can't go away. There is there's frankly an atmosphere of high anxiety, and given that the Press Office is at the heart of probably the most serious charge, it makes it very difficult for government. Because,
I don't know how they're concentrating at the moment on anything. All this going on.
What do you get from them?
They're being phoned up about all sorts of things, important things like, Plan B for COVID, for example. How are they able to focus on their response to those stories when they're embroiled, potentially waiting for, if the police were going to investigate, a knock on the door from police, potentially, or a career-ending moment for them? It must be a huge distraction for them. One source told me that the atmosphere in there is absolutely horrific, funereal ethereal, in fact, was the way they described it to me, that people are walking around silently, just kind of feeling as if the world has come to an end.
I mean, they'll have seen our former colleague, Allegra Stratton, in tears.
Yeah.
And they would have been profoundly shocked by that. I mean, they've worked with her. And, they saw her basically saying, look, I take responsibility, I've got to go. And they're wondering, well, will I be next?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very, very difficult. But the other point, which is the one that will obviously matter to millions of British people, is what impact this is going to have on, Boris Johnson and the government. And one of the things that is very, very clear is that erstwhile supporters, whether they are in the party, whether they are voters, or MPs and ministers, are fed up, many of them completely disenchanted. If you look at the kind of places where Tory members congregate online, you will read them saying, and this is standard, well, he got us Brexit, he won us an election, but he's not fit to be Prime Minister. And that is something you read a lot from loyal Tories. This is horrendous for him.
And this is new, because there have been lots of questions, and every week I've been having conversations with you on the evening news about how much damage is done by this or that particular scandal, and nothing seems to stick. But you think that this one has real sticking power, do you?
It comes on the back of a series of misjudgments. I mean, many of his MPs were furious at being forced to vote, as they saw it, to let their colleague Owen Paterson off the hook over the conclusions of the Standards Committee that he was guilty of breaching lobbying rules. They held their noses and did it, and then the Prime Minister did a complete U-turn. And back in their constituencies, they look like mugs. And there've been a series of, some would say accidents, others would just say very bad judgments by the Prime Minister.
And I think you can kind of tell that ministers are fed up too, right, Robert? I mean, I thought it was interesting the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, was on the airwaves this morning talking about how upset he was when he saw the footage of that Downing Street press briefing where they were joking about the party. And he said that he'd received assurances before he went on air this morning that there was no wrongdoing. Almost seemed to be hinting that maybe there'd been a conversation behind the scenes where he had said, look, if you want me to go on air and defend this, you have got to tell me that nothing went on, because I am sick to death of going out there and spinning the lines that ultimately end up not to be true.
And of course, he was due on air yesterday morning doing the rounds, but he wasn't seen anywhere, was he?
But also, just to go back to this, OK, it is just conceivable that, Simon Case, the Permanent Secretary, and his main job is to support the Prime Minister, will be able to come up with a conclusion that these were somehow work-related meetings, right? The public will not buy it, right? If he comes back and simply says, getting drunk on a Friday night with your colleagues at that moment when, as you have pointed out, millions of British people were either, in a best case, simply stuck at home, but in a worst case, unable to see their loved ones in care homes, in hospitals, dying in some cases. I don't think the British people will forgive the government if broadly, they find some loophole which says this is basically OK.
Yeah, which they did arguably for Barnard Castle, didn't they? So, can the public have any faith that any investigation will actually come up with a conclusion that they can respect? I
mean, I think one of the interesting things here is that the police aren't investigating as things currently stand as we speak this evening, which many people find quite extraordinary. I mean, Labour Party said it's implausible for the police not to be investigating. The Metropolitan Police themselves say there's not any evidence, and also they don't retrospectively investigate COVID-related crimes. But there is evidence, isn't there? I mean, we've got the video where they're laughing and joking. We've got identifiable people in that video they could go in and speak to, even in an informal way, if they wanted to gather some evidence. So that is a huge question at the moment. Why aren't police investigating, at least having a little look? Because they did investigate Dominic Cummings, and they decided not to take any further, but they did investigate for 3 days. So why not here?
I mean, the weird thing, genuinely, and this is, I think, what may ultimately, whether it's now or at some future point, may do really serious harm to the Prime Minister, is he never takes the tough decision early. When this story broke in the Mirror, OK, if they'd put out a statement simply saying, look, it was the end of a long day, these people have been working incredibly hard, we're sorry we made mistakes, but...
Like the Department for Education
like the Department of Education. But we, you know, and everybody's been reprimanded, but, you know, everybody was under pressure at the time, right? I think broadly they would have, you know, some people would have been as, you know, very angry, but I think they would have just about ridden it out. It's the stark denials that the parties happened or that any rules were broken, that I think has turned this into such a big problem. Because, you know, cover-ups are what ultimately do huge damage to prime ministers throughout history. And there's, you know, I mean, there's another sort of, some might say, slightly smaller example of this today, which is there was this question being raised week after week, particularly, again, in this case, work done by the Daily Mail, about the fact that the Tory party seemed to be paying significant sums of money, tens of thousands of pounds, to wallpaper the Downing Street flat, right? This is extraordinary, you know, the so-called gold wallpaper from this, you know, top-of-the-range designer called Lulu Little, right? Now, there is somebody within Downing Street, a bloke called Lord Guy, used to work for the royal family, brought in to basically police ministerial standards. And he did a report a few months ago in which he said that actually the Prime Minister had not breached the rules by failing to disclose who paid for the wallpaper, right? Because we had subsequently discovered that it had been paid for by this very wealthy businessman called Lord Brownlow. And he accepted the Prime Minister's word that he didn't know that Lord Brownlow, somehow he was in the dark about it, right? So today, the Electoral Commission has put out a report which shows conversations in November, in December, in February, between whether they're electronic conversations or, conversations over the phone, it doesn't say, but, you know, there are conversations between the Prime Minister and this bloke, Lord Brownlow, in which Lord Brownlow tells him, I'm, you know, spending this much money on this amount of wallpaper. It is stretching credibility to believe at no point during these conversations did it cross the Prime Minister's mind that Lord Brownlow was paying for this stuff out of his own pocket. It is bizarre that Lord Guy accepted the view that somehow the Prime Minister never bothered to ask Lord Brownlow whether or not he was paying this money out of his own pocket. The fundamental point here being that there is this thing called the Register of Ministers' Interests, and if you know that somebody is paying you significant sums of money, as Lord Brownlow was, you have to put it in the Register of Members' Interests. And he didn't. So the question is it remotely plausible that the Prime Minister never crossed the Prime Minister's mind to ask Lord Brownlow, where is £112,000 coming from? I mean, so there are so many of these things which come back and bite him.
But it's to come back to this particular issue, because that is fascinating. We do another whole podcast about that, you know, endless. It's all a question of trust, isn't it? It's an undermining public trust. And in this case, it's a question of life and death, isn't it? But here we have today the launch of Plan B, which some people are saying is a diversionary tactic, but people may not be willing to accept those rules and obey them anymore because they don't trust this government.
Yeah, people are thinking, right, so they're tightening the rules, but they look pretty slack in Downing Street at the time. The people making the rules were breaking the rules. And it's the tone of it as well. I think that's what struck people about the video, was the laughing and the joking, when, as Robert has just said, people were facing really serious decisions at the time. You know, it wasn't just about Christmas parties. It was about not being able to spend time with loved ones in their dying days. You know, this wasn't a laughing matter, actually, a year ago. It was a very, very serious situation for many people. And many people, I think, still carry that hurt and that pain from this time last year. People are actually quite traumatised, a lot of people, by what they went through during the pandemic. Even if they didn't lose someone, it was hard enough, actually, for a lot of people being in lockdown.
There wasn't much giggling, that's for sure, last year.
I just want one little thing on that, which is, again, relevant to the trouble that the Prime Minister is in. Omicron is a very serious problem. It's spreading very fast. We know this. You know, obviously, I've been writing and broadcasting about this a lot. But, you know, there was an expectation that the announcement on Plan B would be probably the end of the week or early next week. What Tory MPs themselves allege, and this is Tory MPs, is that he brought forward the Plan B announcement to try and distract from this mega embarrassment about the parties. We, had one of them, William Ragg, standing up in Parliament and saying this was a diversionary tactic. And that undermines the credibility of the rules, because Tory MPs who don't like, for example, mask wearing and some of these and the COVID passports are basically saying, Prime Minister, you're doing this to basically, create a story to distract from your problems, and it's another reason why we're not going to vote for it.
And who's masterminding that behind the scenes? The communications team, who are also accused of going to the party.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tangled, isn't it? So where does it go from here? Final thought from each of you.
I mean, where it goes from here is that ITV, Paul and the rest of us are going to continue to be digging around to find out more about what happened. We will be waiting on the report from Simon Case to see if it is robust.
We don't know when that's going to come.
Credible, and we don't yet know. I mean, seriously, it shouldn't take very long. I mean, the cast of the people at these parties is not very large, but our experience is if particularly we've all watched Westminster. We know when the senior civil servant takes charge, they'll run it for as long as possible. Again, in the hope that somehow people will care less by the time it emerges. So we're obviously waiting for the Case report. But we're also just, waiting to see, and this is a terrible position for a Prime Minister to be in, what's the next accident going to be? Because he's looking like an accident-prone Prime Minister.
And there's a by-election coming?
There is a by-election coming next week. The Lib Dems, when you speak to them, are remarkably confident.
I can imagine. Final thought from you, Paul. I mean, it's been a hell of a week for you, hasn't it? Remarkable.
Yeah, it's been a busy week, and I think the mood of the nation's shifted quite considerably over the course of this week. I think there is a large amount of nerves in Downing Street right now, not just for the political reasons that Robert pointed out, but also the criminal reasons. I mean, if there is evidence that's brought forward that then spurs the police to investigate, as I said earlier, people are facing a criminal conviction potentially. So that, for me, is what we're watching next. Will there be any evidence that does get the police investigation across the line? And perhaps can we get some answers from the police about why they haven't investigated the evidence that's already on the table?
Yeah, fascinating. Paul Brand, Robert Peston, thank you both very much indeed. And we appreciate your time, and we know that you'll be across this story for us in the coming days and indeed weeks. Do join us on ITV News, on our bulletins and across all our digital platforms for all the latest twists and turns as we continue to follow this really extraordinary story and see how it develops in the coming days. From me and all of us at ITV News, thank you very much and goodbye.